Undergraduate. Hi, for this section of the Philosophy Undergraduate Conference, we have Helen Zhao, a sophomore at Johns Hopkins, speaking on the knowledge of primary substances, followed by comments from me, Rosemary Twomey, of CUNY, Hunter College, and Fordham. All right, Helen, over to you.
So, in this paper, I address what I deem a crucial epistemic concern underlying Aristotle's concepts of substance and property. However, before I begin, let's consider two basic tenets of Aristotle's beliefs. Firstly, unlike Plato, whose interests lie in the abstract forms, Aristotle emphasizes primary substances, objects largely of the material world to which anything else categorically belongs. A certain shape, size, and softness are properties belonging to an individual bed, for instance. Virtue is a property belonging to that particular object which is virtuous. Secondly, among properties categories belonging to primary substances, he distinguishes those comprising a substance count, known as essential properties, and necessarily belonging to a substance, from those he claims to arise from coincidence, namely accidental properties which do not comprise a substance's definition. Given these, it seems that we need only recognize essential properties necessary to describe the essential natures of substances in order to attain knowledge of the material world. However, the question now arises, how does one distinguish essential properties from accidental properties? After all, Aristotle leaves much to be desired in answering this question. Within posterior analytics, he describes 4 cases where A is essential to the description of B and belongs to its own right. A is a necessary component of B, such as a point in a line, for instance, or A is a necessary component of B, and B itself is necessary, such as straightness in a line. The count A of the substance B exclusively describes B, or A is a necessary component of B simply because of B itself. For instance, an animal must be killed in order to be sacrificed, and it was not a coincidence that the animal was killed in being sacrificed. In summary, A represents the definitional element whose essence is also known. However, while these definitions allow us to define the essential properties of mathematical or geometrical elements, it's my view that substances, which are substances known a priori, it's my view that they do little to explain how properties comprising the definitions of ordinary substances and empirically may be recognized if their definitions are yet understood. In other words, the justification for a property's essentiality cannot be verified until the definition is known. However, the definition cannot be known without having determined the substance's essential properties. We're led full circle. Thus, the purpose of this paper is to address these concerns by exploring 2 possible responses to the epistemic question of how we recognize essential properties and evaluating Aristotle's possible reply to each. Following, I plan to formulate my own understanding of essential properties in order that Aristotle's classification of properties may retain its epistemic relevance despite certain problematic applications. So the first response that I shall consider invokes what I call the statistical argument. It states that essential properties are simply more present among the total population of considered objects than accidental properties. And if one desires to know the essences of things, one needs only determine which properties are more prevalent by means of statistical techniques. However, several problems immediately occur with this response. First, how should one understand the condition of more? To be clear, the term certainly should not imply an irrelevant difference in prevalence, since to allow such loose interpretation would be to trivialize essential and accidental properties. Rather, I should say that the difference in prevalence must be shown to be statistically significant. In other words, we must have high confidence by means of calculations that properties deemed essential are consistently and definitively more present in means of determining the essential properties of substances. However, can this reply adequately skeptic? Consider the following case. Suppose that 99% of cows are black and white, and 1% of cows are purple. where the purple cows are located on an island removed from the rest of the world. By statistical reasoning, we may believe that black and white is an essential feature of the cow, not only because it's more prevalent, but also because it's more prevalent in a statistically significant sense. Now imagine that some unforeseen event kills all black and white cows, but spares the purple cows. According to the statistical argument, any person desiring to know the essence of the cow following the disaster and by valid statistical methods would be justified in considering purple to be an essential feature. However, at a previous time, one would have said an essential feature of cows was its black and white coloration. Therefore, the cow is as unchanging as Aristotle claims, and that it will not be possible for the same thing to be and not to be. A statistical argument cannot be a valid means by which to determine essential properties. So I two ways in which Aristotle might attempt to save this response in order to satisfy the epistemic challenge. First, he might offer a classificatory scheme that allows both for purple to be an essential feature of purple cows and for purple cows to still be cows, whose essential properties do not include purple. For instance, the cow might be what he calls the secondary substance, the species in which the things primarily called primary substances belong. Purple cows would thus constitute the primary substances whose color purple would indeed be an essential property of purple cows, while black and white would represent an essential property of black and white cows. In this classification, there would be no contradiction in the above case, since purple cows and black and white cows would be entirely different primary substances, entirely different things, in other words, altogether within the larger category of cow. However, I believe this response does not satisfy the real epistemic concern. For the person who has never seen or known a cow before and who is unaware that the genus cow may be divided into purple cows and black and white cows, a cow is purple. To him or her, that species of purple cow is not a subclass of cow, but rather the cow. Once again, we face a contradiction, since those who had only known black and white cows to exist in a previous time would have, according to the statistical argument, been compelled to conclude that black and white represented an essential property of the cow. Thus, if we concede purple to also be an essential property, it is objective, or I should say no epistemically objective, or more importantly, unchanging fact of the matter would exist from the person's perspective. It so happened by chance that the cow had certain essential features because of one's epistemic. So here we consider Aristotle's second attempt to save this statistical argument. He might simply regard the person, for whom purple is an essential property of the cow, to be wrong. In other words, he might insist that there is an epistemically objective fact of the matter. Black and white, or no color at all, is an essential feature of the cow, and he who thinks otherwise is mistaken. However, to Aristotle, I would reply that even if the person is wrong, he cannot know he is wrong. Are simply defined as properties which are statistically more present. It appears that the statistical distinction between essential and accidental properties is too sharp and must be revised if we do suppose an epistemically objective fact of the matter. So a second response that I shall consider invokes what I call the functional argument, a response most like Aristotle's own view, which identifies essential properties as those achieving the substances and their function. In this section, I will discuss what I consider a key weakness in this approach. However, before I begin, let's clarify certain things. According to Aristotle, in order to have knowledge of substances, to know why, we must possess explanations arising from four causes. 1. A material cause that explains the substance's properties in terms of constituents and material parts. 2. A formal cause that invokes as explanation a substance's essential nature and essential properties. 3. An efficient cause that explains the source of change, or how the substance came to be. And 4. A final or teleological cause comprising the end of the substance, or what the substance is for. For instance, Aristotle would cite the material cause of a pen to be its plastic and ink, the formal cause to be the essence of the pen, the efficient cause to be the machine that makes it, and the final cause to be what the pen is for. to write. It's worthy to note that, according to Aristotle, the final cause would not be man-made, as appears in the above example. Rather, the final cause would rely on the form of the substance, for the end of a substance would be to exhibit its essential nature. The form must be what things are for, as Aristotle says. This statement embodies what I call the functional argument, and appears to resolve concerns that have plagued Aristotle's concept of essence thus far. Some might say that we now have a means, both objective and universal, by which to identify essential properties. First, determine what a substance is for. Next, determine the form of the substance, and thus its essential properties. However, I reply that Aristotle's explanation still does little good. According to Aristotle, the essence must inform the final cause of a substance, yet we had hoped via the functional argument to inform its essence. Notes neither the formal cause nor final cause of a novel substance. Once again, we are led to the question of how we empirically determine a substance's form or essential properties given no tools but observation. Aristotle might offer a second clarifying statement that an essential property is that which allows the substance to be a flourishing exemplar of its type, to be excellent. After all, according to him, by end, terminus, but only the best one. Unfortunately, this raises a further question as to how we should understand the term excellent, especially in treatment of non-living substances where survival and reproduction cannot be said to play a part. For instance, imagine that an early human happens across a sharpened pencil. He's never seen this particular object before. He knows of objects' close appearance, spears and knives, for instance. The pencil is sharp, it's made of woody material. To the early human, the pencil's excellent end is that of a weapon, and he distinguishes essential properties as those contributing to that end. That the pencil writes is deemed irrelevant and deemed an essential property. Thus, even if an objective of the matter exists, how is he to know he is wrong? We may conclude that the functional argument, too, fails to address the epistemic questions. The problems with the statistical and functional views compel us to redefine essential properties in such a way as to circumvent these concerns. Otherwise, we may never know the essences of material substances whose forms must be discovered empirically. In the previous sections, we questioned the relevance of essential and accidental properties when we struggled to discover a means by which to distinguish these two kinds of properties. After all, what use is there in defining the essential property to be that which describes the essence of a substance, and the accidental property is that which does not, if the distinction offers no clarity in application? One might adopt some sort of relativism, according to which the essence of a substance is simply that which one decides it to be. Thus, we could resolve our quandary by trivializing the distinction between essential and accidental properties, such that any properties could be legitimately ascribed to one substance, even those which were mutually exclusive, i.e., if both purple and black and white were deemed essential colorations of the cow. However, I propose that we need not relinquish all objectivity yet. In this section, I will avoid the relativist claim and save Aristotle's conception of essential properties by conceiving 1. The form or essential nature of the substance to be a psychological description, and 2. The essential properties to be those things which comprise our psychological descriptions. This view I shall call the conceptual argument, whose purpose I claim will be to interpret Aristotle's categories of property to generate a plausible reply to the epistemic question. To begin, consider what I mean by psychological descriptions. First, I imply something more common than simply images which one envisions upon experiencing some evocative trigger, a word, sound, smell, or other. These images are highly variable. The specific focus and details may differ from person to person. I, for instance, for a dog, envision a small, shaggy-haired terrier with a friendly demeanor, while on the other hand, someone else might conceive a long-legged, growling hound. However, these two images can't both in their entirety represent the essential nature of the being. Otherwise, we might have an infinite number of essential natures rather than only one if we do suppose an objective fact of the matter. That both psychological images, both of the terrier and of the hound are evoked by the word dog must imply that both images share something in common, a framework of sorts comprising key elements or essential properties of the substance dog, especially since we are not unlimited in the kinds of psychological images that we conceive. We do not envision a tree, for instance, upon experiencing a dog trigger. Consequently, I propose that if we desire to know the essential natures of substances, we need only determine the frameworks of essential properties that compose our psychological images and allow us to recognize the substances as such. These frameworks I will refer to as our psychological descriptions of substances. In the meantime, one might ask me how my formulation of essential properties surpasses the functional argument. After all, are we not obliged to recognize the substance before we can describe it, and to describe the substance before we can recognize it? To this question of circularity, I reply no for the following reason. Unlike Aristotle's functional argument, which offers no means to begin to determine a substance's final cause and thereby essence, I do suggest an empirical method through which to obtain the psychological description of a substance. Consider this. Upon encountering a dog, I unconsciously compare my image of a shaggy-haired terrier to the subject before me. While I will note certain differences in details, shape, color, demeanor, I will still instinctively and almost immediately conclude that the substance before me is a dog, because the new substance meets certain criteria that I've set given my psychological description of a dog. If I encounter a tree, on the other hand, I will unlikely deem it a dog simply because the tree does not meet the criteria set by my psychological description. Therefore, if I desire to know my psychological description of the dog, I need only be presented with enough counter cases to determine which features of the dog are necessary for me to judge a substance to be a dog. For instance, let's imagine a simple experiment where a subject who possesses a psychological description of dog is shown various images. For every image he considers to be an accurate representation of a dog, he must respond yes, and for every image that he does not consider a dog, he must quickly respond no. If shown a picture of the tree, we may assume that he will respond no for various reasons. A tree is not an animal, a tree is four-legged, a tree has no face. In addition, if shown an image of a cat, we may assume that he will respond no, but for different reasons. A cat does not have a long snout. A cat has a long, thin tail. A cat has a smaller face. Note that the subject is not usually conscious of these differences. Rather, he answers based on a gut reaction, which he wished to be a dog. Nonetheless, from his responses, we may glean the essential properties ascribed to the dog by comparing the various images he rejects to those he accepts and identifying differences, increasingly specific as the images grow closer in likeness to the object in question. I don't claim that this method will give us the exact boundaries at which substances teeter into the category of dog. It will, however, allow us some empirical means by which to somewhat clearly glean the essential properties of substances without succumbing to circularity or total arbitrariness. At this point, I may receive the following response from the relativist camp. Are not psychological descriptions subject to various situational influences, given that they originate within the mind and appear to be products of human invention? Does that not imply some sort of relativity to what we deem essential properties of substances? If so, is not Aristotle's distinction between essential and accidental properties once again subject to doubt? My response comes in two parts. First, I agree that the conceptual argument allows for greater subjectivity than Aristotle would like. To understand why, let's look again at the cow example, first mentioned in section 1 of this paper, and examine how psychological descriptions come to be. Recall that, following the aforementioned disaster, only purple cows exist. Now imagine that a person who has never seen or known a cow before and has no psychological description of the cow desires to know what a cow is. When his guide points to the purple cow and tells him that it is a cow, he will at first have no psychological image with which to compare the substance before him. At that time, there will be no essential properties of cows to him, only accidental properties, and he will simply have to believe his guide. Following, imagine that he returns to the island several times and is told again and again that various individual purple cows are cows. Most likely, after repeated instances, the person will not be able to divorce the substance cow from the purple. In this case, as Aristotle said, A will necessarily belong to B, and purple will become an essential property of the cow to the person by virtue of his acquired psychological description. Statistical probability would thus, in this way, play a part in the development of one's psychological description. However, imagine that the person desired to know the cow before the disaster and before anyone was aware that purple cows existed on the island. In these circumstances, the guide would point to a cow instead. The person would come to consider black and white as an essential property of the cow, and we would, it would appear, obtain mutually exclusive conclusions. In this sense, I would agree that what we deem to be essential properties would vary by context. However, note that in order for the person who has no psychological descriptions to discover the cow, he must have a guide who already possesses a psychological description. The task would have proven near impossible for the person upon arriving on the island with no knowledge to determine alone which substance is the cow. As a result, we may conclude that psychological descriptions depend not only upon epistemes, but also upon the psychological descriptions already adopted. Likewise, properties essential at the present depend on existing beliefs of what is essential. Thus, essential properties admit of relativity external to the framework of what is socially deemed essential, given that frameworks vary. However, within frameworks, our psychological descriptions still remain somewhat epistemically objective due to shared psychological descriptions that are largely bound by our social and temporal circumstances. So in conclusion, in response to how we distinguish essential properties from accidental properties, I replied that essential properties are features who are psychological descriptions of substances, whereas accidental properties are not. As a result, given the variability of our descriptions, it would appear that differences between substances, while not entirely arbitrary, are neither as deep and objective, nor the methods by which we determine the essentiality of their properties as simple as Aristotle might have supposed. However, in order that we may continue to understand how our concepts arise, further work in both philosophy and other fields will be necessary. Thank you.
Thanks. I really like that paper. It's very interesting. It's a great topic.
Thank you.
Yeah, the topic of sort of the epistemic circle that you get between definition and essential properties and demonstration, it's a very tight epistemic circle, and you do a good job of showing how difficult it would be for us to know that we've ascertained the essential properties of things, especially normal perceptual objects like cows and pencils and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you're absolutely right about all that, and it's a very subtle discussion you have about the complications there. Yeah, of course. So I agree with all that. The notion of essential properties that he has and of definition and things like that is not in the first instance definition of concepts or words or however you'd want to put that. It's really definition of objects themselves, the substances, so we have definitions of the primary substances. I think, if you think about it like when you say a person's got well-defined biceps or something like that, where what you mean is that the boundaries of them are not vague, right? So it's not that I understand the person's biceps really clearly or something like that. It's just that what is the bicep and what is not is perfectly clear, at least in the order of things, even if you can't see it, if they're really far away or whatever might keep you from knowing that. So when he talks about definition, he has in mind something more like that, where the essential properties are things that indeed we might have a lot of trouble knowing and understanding. But they're still going to have the essential properties they have. So I think ultimately the psychological descriptions account you give, it might be a good account of our words, or at the very least a good test, right, to see whether this object could be properly, that this word, cow or whatever, could properly apply to the object. So Aristotle says words, spoken words, symbols of affections of the soul. So that suggests, like you say, that there's going to be like a strong psychological component there. So that account you give, the psychological description account, is really, I think, promising for what words signify. But the definitions of substances, I think you're right when you say that the functional account that you look at second is probably what Aristotle would be most attracted to, or what he might expressly think. But the pencil example, absolutely right. If you don't know what these objects are for, if you don't know what the ends of them are, then certainly, it's going to be very difficult epistemically to know that you've come across the essential properties of the thing. The other thing about the statistical account you looked at, I thought that was the best. You went through all of the problems with that, and the example of the cows is a useful, good example. I like to picture this little island with lots of purple cows on it, just hanging out. For all we know, it exists. And so what you said, the way you criticize and everything is, I think, exactly right. The only thing I'd add to that is that even if we, found a genuinely necessary property, right? So it wasn't just accidentally prevalent or anything like that, but it really was a necessary property. Essential properties are not just necessary and sufficient. They also have to be sort of explanatory. So he has examples like triangles. The internal angles add up to 2 right angles, right? That's a necessary feature of a triangle, but it's an accidental one. It's not going to be an essential property of it. So that's an even further problem with that method. So I definitely agree that method's not available to him. But in general, I really enjoyed the paper. It's a great, really interesting topic to me. David Charles wrote a really good book, Aristotle, Meaning and Essence. Talks about a lot of these things. So I'd recommend you look at that. But I really appreciated and enjoyed the paper. So
thank you. I really like your objection. Your comment on how this paper, while it does question the way in which we can come to discover the essences of material substances, it doesn't really attack Aristotle's metaphysics, or at least it doesn't seem able to attack Aristotle's metaphysics, because we may be wrong, or we may never be able to know what the essences of things are, but that doesn't change the fact that the essences of things are exactly what they are. What essential properties are in relation to the object may always be true, whether or not we're able to ever discover what those essential properties are. So I agree. As far as I believe that, so the reason why I guess my paper doesn't make that clear distinction. Well, first of all, when I was writing this paper, I wasn't very aware of a distinction between epistemic objectivity and ontological objectivity, or the epistemic question and the metaphysical question. In my mind, they've been sort of like conflated, which it's a mistake. But I also realized.
Well, there's so much philosophy is people confusing epistemology and metaphysics. And there's philosophy on it's not a confusion, So it's like it's a very natural sort of move to make. So you have a lot of really good people that make similar observations. So
Well, so I think that was even if it's a common mistake, I guess it was a mistake that I sort of made. But as I was writing the third section about my conceptual argument, I sort of realized that what I'm really attacking is this idea that essences not only can be known through simply the application of pure reasoning, simply by contemplating what a triangle is and realizing, oh, a triangle has the necessary property of 3 sides, or the necessary property wherein the sum of their angles is the sum of 2 right angles. So I'm rejecting that claim in favor of the claim that what we call essences are really, they can really only be answered through empirical inquiry. So if I want to know what the essence of a phone is, I can't just sit in my armchair and think, what is the essence of a phone? Well, a phone allows me to talk, while holding it against my ear. In my mind, maybe in some future time, like there are no phones with wires, so I'll think a phone is something I can carry with me at all times. But yeah, this is not that great of an example. But all I'm trying to say is that I don't.
It's a perfectly fine example.
Huh? I'm sorry.
I just said it's a good example. It's a good example.
Thank you. Well.
Just have a little bit of a delay. Yeah.
Anyway, so I guess all I'm trying to say is you can't come to know what the essences of substances are just by sitting in your armchair and contemplating the substances. Because, and I guess I'm trying to show in these, through my examples, I'm trying to show that the functional argument doesn't work because just by thinking about what an object is for isn't going to allow you to know what the essence of that object is. You have to, the essence will only arise through experience, and it's something that is setting relative, which is why different people in different settings might sit in their armchair and come to different conclusions. So I think this paper is simply just rejecting the notion that essences can be known through, rationalist approach.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right about things like phones and pencils and stuff like that. So in the Metaphysics, Aristotle says that you can't have definitions and demonstrations of perceptual objects, which is probably stronger than what he really means. He just really wants to say we can't have like genuinely science, like the kind of knowledge that he talks about in the posterior analytics, which usually gets called scientific knowledge. But scientific there isn't like observational. It's like systematically coherent, like a science. So you can't have that kind of understanding or knowledge about phones or pencils or anything for pretty much exactly the reasons you're pointing out, which is that you're never going to, he says demonstrations are of necessary truths, triangles and stuff like that. And you're never, it's an accident that a phone looks the way it does or has various features. And so you're going to have to do sort of observations, just like you're saying, in order to have any grasp of them. And that does lead to an amount of uncertainty about whether we've really grasped the essential properties of regular stuff, phones and people and stuff like that. So I think, yeah, you're definitely right about that. And it's, disheartening, but it's not clear to me there's anything that can really be done about it. It doesn't seem to me to be like great to say that cows are what the essential properties of a cow are depend on what we think cows are. So that's got its own negative features. So it's like either way, it's not perfect or ideal. But you definitely pointed out the reasons why you wouldn't want or you couldn't have sort of proper demonstrations and so on of cows and pencils. And so I think you're onto something, and I would definitely check out that book, which has a much very thorough discussion. Yeah,
I will. Yeah. So how much time do we have left?
I don't know. I think we can just go however long we want to.
Okay.
If you have another question or another observation, or I think. Did I say anything else in my comments to you that I haven't mentioned?
I think your main problem, I guess, maybe with the paper was just, where, I seem to be trying to attack Aristotle's metaphysics, but I can't really attack Aristotle's metaphysics with what I have in here. I can only attack the, epistemology of essences.
Yeah, that we know that we've identified the right essential properties is, possibly impossible, as it were.
Right.
Yeah. But you're absolutely right about that.
So the reason why I was bringing up this thing about a rationalistic approach versus an empirical approach is, I think, like, even though maybe it's not explicit in the paper, I actually think that essences don't exist, um, given what I've, sort of realized as I've been considering the epistemic question. And the reason for that is because, um, so according to Aristotle, you and modern day modal characterization of essence, an essential property is something that an object cannot be conceived to exist without. So if an object doesn't have that essential property, then it just can't be even conceived to exist, or it actually physically can't exist. I think that's my understanding of the modal characterization of essence.
Yeah, that's a contemporary. I just can't think. I mean, sometimes it's a genuine discovery, right? So that water is H2O, for instance. That's an
Mm-hmm.
essential property of water, but that was a discovery. And so it's not difficult for average people to imagine that it's not H2O or something like that. In fact, it's difficult to imagine it is because I don't really know if I'm imagining it properly, you know? So I'm just trying to think that
Uh,
that's a way that we like to talk about modal necessity, like, oh, you can imagine otherwise or you can't conceive otherwise. But I'm just trying to think if there's a precedent for that in Aristotle in particular. I
well,
mean,
I
a lot
mean,
of
when
these
I
things
was
might be conceivable to us just because of
so
our lack of knowledge.
So in from posterior analytics, I brought up those four cases because in every instance, Aristotle, in some way or other, says that an account A is essential to the description of B if A is somehow necessary, or you just simply, it seems to me like he's saying you simply cannot even conceive of B without A, because, for instance, a point in a line, how can one think of a line without invoking a point in one's, maybe not explicitly thinking, oh, a point, but when you think of a line, you have to think of a point, whether or not you realize you're thinking of points.
Yeah, yeah, I think that might again be a facet of those kinds of examples that you get in the posterior analytics, so you have necessary demonstrations.
Mm-hmm.
But scientific cases, it would still, it seems to me, be the case that many of the essential properties of perceptual objects, of regular objects, are things that we wouldn't immediately be able to tell were the essential characteristics for all the reasons you pointed out, and therefore we presumably would be able to conceive of the objects not having them. If we
So
couldn't conceive of it, then we'd sort of know right away, or we at least have a good evidence that those were essential properties.
I guess what I want to say is that, for the layman who doesn't know that water is, the chemical formula of water is H2O, and they can conceive of water without thinking of H2O, um, I mean, I would say that they, even though they aren't explicitly thinking of the chemical formula H2O, they're still, H2O is still part of the conception of water necessarily. Like, just like you can't conceive of a line without conceiving of points, whether or not you realize that such a geometrical entity as a point even exists. Um,
Yeah.
the line simply can't be, it just can't be considered, not in a particular mind, but just, I'm trying to, it's hard for me to
Yeah.
say exactly what I mean, but yeah.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think that might be right, I mean, that might be a reason to think that we don't necessarily know what's conceivable, even though that sounds kind of funny. But
Yeah.
if that's right, then that sort of bumps into what you said about the psychological explanations, right? Which seem to take us as having authority about what kinds of things seem to suit our words and so on and so forth. So if that's right, then that's going to be a problem in
So,
those cases.
right. So what I want to say is that so like okay, yeah, exactly. That's precisely my point. So the modal, this is what
Yeah.
how the modal characters thinks of essence, or how according to the modal characterization, essence is thought of. It's thought of something that's necessary, or you just can't divorce the substance or concept from the essence or essential property. That's my understanding of the modal characterization of essence, and sort of what Aristotle is saying here. And I'm saying that if that's Aristotle's view, then given what I've realized about how we come to know essential properties, um, I don't think that essence can exist then, because so like so yeah, so I guess actually, you know what you were saying about the water example is probably, I don't know why I was arguing against you, because what you said was probably exactly what I think. You're right. So like maybe in the time when people didn't regard water as H2O, before we knew that H2O was the chemical formula of water, when you thought of what was the essential property of water, you were you were um, you just didn't even think of H2O. Like that wasn't part of the essence of water um, at that time. And
Well, he wouldn't put it that way. I mean, it still would. I guess that's part of the point. It would have been part of the essence. It's just that it might not have been a part of our psychological description of it, which is, one of the reasons why he'd want to divorce the psychological description from the essence of the thing. But it might not have been part of the meaning of the word water, maybe,
oh,
arguably.
so that's what you mean
Uh,
by okay.
right, but the actual thing, the actual substance, it would have been an essential property of it, even then. We just wouldn't have known that it was.
hmm It just
Yeah.
seems like in this account, part of being like how we define what is essential is defined by what can be possibly conceived. Or,
There are a lot of people who are uncomfortable with essences. So,
mhm.
thinking that there is some property that all these things have to have. Uh, I mean, you're in good company with just being skeptical of essences in general, but it's an important part of Aristotle. So he's not. If he came back, I don't know, he'd have to change a lot of stuff he says if he was persuaded by these anti-essentialists. Yeah.
Yeah, I think okay. So I think this is what I was trying to say. When we think of what an essence is, we are necessarily thinking of what is conceivable, or what an object is without which it could not be conceivable. And so, since everything depends on whether something is conceivable in order to, define the essence of something, if something is conceivable without a certain property in one setting, yet inconceivable without a certain property in another setting, it seems to me that according to this characterization of essence, essence itself would be changing, not simply how we come to know essence.
Yeah, yeah. I myself am a little uncomfortable with the conceivability entails possibility kind of move, and I know
Yeah,
that's increasingly common. It seems at a minimum very arrogant to think that
yeah,
whatever I can think of um, is somehow therefore actually possible, and also
yeah,
what I can't think of is impossible. Right? That's equally sort of weird. So I'm uh, sympathetic to that. And like I said, Aristotle doesn't talk that way. I think he'd be sympathetic to that too. But you don't have to get rid of essences altogether, just to say that or necessary properties or anything like that. Just to say
we,
that whether I can
yeah.
conceive it is not especially relevant to whether it's necessary or not.
I guess if we're going to keep essence, this idea, this concept, we probably have to revise how we characterize it. Like you said, like we can't characterize it as something that is without which an object would be inconceivable or something. Like yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Otherwise, it just falls prey to these sorts of objections in my paper.
yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, I think the objections you raise are real problems, and they point out like very
Yeah.
essential, very central complications. So I definitely appreciated that.
Yeah. Well, that was a
All right.
great discussion.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, good. Of course. If you ever need anything else or you want to run anything else by me, you have my email address, so
Thank
go
you.
right ahead.
Are you
Of
do you
course.
specialize in like David Charles or Aristotle or?
I work mostly on Aristotle's theory of perception, so the psychology more than the metaphysics. The De Anima is the primary text that I work on,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah.
Okay. Well, as I'm reading David, if I have any questions, I might email you.
Oh, of course, yeah. I've gone through that book a few times. I've never read it cover to cover, but it's very rich. So there's a lot of stuff in there, and I
Great.
welcome another reason to look at it. So,
Great.
and you can get it online on probably. I assume Johns Hopkins has. If you go to the library, the Oxford
Yeah.
Scholarship Online,
Yeah.
and you can
Oh,
just download the chapters. So,
yeah. Great.
all right,
Great.
take care.
Thank you.
I hope
Bye.
that helped. All right,
Yes,
bye.
definitely.
Okay, cool.
Bye.
Bye.